Cottonwood, Dakota Territory, January 1887. Julia Walsh pushed open the door of the Territorial Bank with her left hand and kept her right hand wrapped around the grip of her father's old Colt revolver hidden under her coat. The bank clerk looked up from his ledger and froze when he saw her face. She was not here to make a deposit.
I need to speak to whoever handles land transfers, and I need to speak to them now.
Her voice cut through the dusty silence like a blade. The clerk stammered and pointed toward the back office, where a young man sat hunched over paperwork. Red Hawkins was 20 days into his new position, and already tired of the lies he had to write down every morning. He looked up when Julia's shadow fell across his desk, and his first thought was that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and his second thought was that she looked ready to kill someone.
My name is Julia Walsh, and 3 months ago this bank processed a land transfer that gave my family's claim to a man named Roland Lockhart. The papers were forged, and I can prove it.
She dropped a folded document on his desk hard enough to make his inkwell jump. Rhett opened it with careful fingers and read the deed signature. Then he pulled the bank's copy from the file cabinet and laid them side by side. The signatures did not match. Not even close. His stomach dropped.
Miss Walsh, if what you are saying is true, then this bank committed fraud.
Not the bank. One man. Roland Lockhart bribed someone to push those papers through, and my father is dead because of it.
Her voice cracked on the last word, and Rhett saw her blink hard against tears she would not let fall. He had spent 2 years working for the bank in Bismarck, and had transferred to Cottonwood because he thought frontier work would be cleaner. He was wrong.
I will help you.
The words came out before he could stop them. Julia stared at him like he had just offered to walk into a fire.
You do not even know me.
I know enough. This is wrong, and I am tired of writing down lies.
Julia pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited.
Roland Lockhart is the stagecoach dispatcher for the northern route. He has been tipping off bandits for at least a year. My father figured it out and confronted him 2 weeks before he died.
How did your father die?
They said it was his heart. But my father was strong. He did not just fall over dead in the middle of winter, for no reason.
Rhett leaned back in his chair and felt the weight of what she was saying settle over him like a cold blanket. If Lockhart was dirty then, half the territory's business was compromised. The stage line was being rerouted through the southern pass to avoid the bandits, and that meant Cottonwood would lose its supply line. The town would die.
Do you have any other proof besides the signature?
I have his pocket watch.
She reached into her coat and pulled out a battered silver watch. The glass was cracked, and the hands were frozen at 11:23.
I found this in my father's hand the morning he died. It is not his watch. It is Roland Lockhart's. I have seen him wear it 100 times. He must have dropped it during the struggle.
Struggle? You think Lockhart killed him?
I know he did.
Rhett picked up the watch and turned it over. The back was engraved with the initials RL and a date from 1875. His hands were shaking.
If we accuse him, without enough evidence, he will destroy us both.
Then we get enough evidence. The circuit judge arrives in 6 days. If we can prove Lockhart forged those papers and connect him to the bandits before then, we can bring him to trial.
And if we cannot?
Then I lose everything, and he gets away with murder.
Rhett looked at her and saw the exhaustion under her fierce expression. She had been carrying this alone for weeks. He stood up and grabbed his coat from the hook.
Where do we start?
We start with the stagecoach office. Lockhart keeps records of every route and every delay. If he is tipping off bandits, then there will be a pattern.
The stagecoach office was locked, but the side window had a loose latch. Rhett pried it open, while Julia kept watch. Inside the office smelled like old leather and tobacco. Rhett lit a small lantern, and Julia started pulling ledgers off the shelf.
Here. Every route that was hit by bandits in the last 6 months.
She laid the pages out on the desk, and Rhett traced the dates with his finger. Every raid happened exactly 2 days after a scheduled supply run. Every single one.
He is telling them when the shipments are coming.
And what they are carrying. Look at this. The raid on the October run happened the same day the Army payroll was being transferred.
Rhett felt his pulse kick up. This was enough to raise questions, but not enough to convict. They needed more.
We need to find his correspondence. If he is sending messages to the bandits, then there will be proof.
Julia moved toward the back room and stopped. Her hand shot out and grabbed Rhett's arm.
Someone is coming.
Footsteps crunched on the frozen ground outside. Rhett killed the lantern and pulled Julia behind the desk. The door rattled. A key turned in the lock. The door swung open, and Roland Lockhart stepped inside. He was a thin man with gray hair and a soft voice that made people trust him. He lit a lamp on the desk and pulled a bottle of whiskey from the drawer. He poured himself a glass and stood there in the dim light, looking at the ledgers on his desk. Then, he turned his head slowly toward the back room. Lockhart walked straight toward the desk where they were hiding. Julia's hand tightened on Rhett's wrist. Lockhart stopped 3 feet away and reached for a folder on the shelf above their heads. Rhett held his breath. Lockhart pulled the folder down and turned back toward the lamp. He opened it and pulled out a letter. Rhett could see the handwriting from where he crouched. It was a list of names and dates. Payment schedules. Lockhart folded the letter and tucked it into his coat pocket. Then, he finished his whiskey and left. The door clicked shut. The lock turned. Julia let out a long, shaky breath.
That letter is the proof we need.
We have to get it before he destroys it.
He keeps everything in his office at the fort. We can get in tonight.
That is breaking and entering.
So was this.
Rhett looked at her and saw the steel in her eyes. She was not going to stop. He could walk away right now and go back to his quiet life, writing ledgers and pretending the world was fair. Or he could help her.
Tonight, then.
They waited until midnight. The fort was quiet, except for the wind rattling through the loose canvas on the supply tents. Julia led the way across the frozen yard toward the small wooden building where Lockhart kept his private office. Rhett picked the lock with a bent nail, and they slipped inside. The room was cold and smelled like ink and old paper. Julia went straight for the desk and started pulling open drawers. Rhett searched the file cabinet.
Rhett.
Her voice was tight. He turned and saw her holding up a stack of letters tied with string. She untied them and spread them out on the desk. They were all addressed to a man named Cutter Hayes. Rhett recognized the name. Hayes was the leader of the bandit gang that had been hitting the stage routes. Each letter contained details about upcoming shipments and the size of the guard. The last letter was dated 3 days ago. It promised a big payroll run in 2 weeks and gave the exact route.
This is it. This is everything we need.
Julia folded the letters and tucked them into her coat. Then she froze. The door creaked open. Roland Lockhart stood in the doorway with a pistol in his hand. His soft voice was colder than the winter air. Lockhart smiled and stepped into the room. He closed the door behind him. Lockhart said he had been expecting them ever since Julia started asking questions around town. He said her father had been a fool for threatening him, and that he had done the world a favor by removing the old man from the equation. Julia's face went white.
You killed him.
Lockhart shrugged. He said it had been simple. A little pressure on the chest during a friendly visit. The old man's heart had given out and no one suspected a thing. He said he would have left Julia alone if she had just accepted the land transfer and moved on. But now, she had dragged a bank clerk into it and forced his hand. He raised the pistol and aimed it at Rhett. Lockhart said he would make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Two fools breaking into his office and getting shot in self-defense. The judge would believe him. Everyone believed him. Julia stepped in front of Rhett.
Shoot me first, then.
Lockhart laughed. He said that was exactly what he planned to do. His finger tightened on the trigger. Rhett shoved Julia aside and lunged. The gun went off. The bullet smashed into the wall behind them. Rhett tackled Lockhart, and they hit the floor hard. The gun skittered across the wood. Julia dove for it. Lockhart kicked Rhett in the ribs and scrambled to his feet. He pulled a knife from his belt. Rhett rolled and came up swinging. His fist connected with Lockhart's jaw, and the older man staggered back. Julia grabbed the pistol and cocked the hammer.
Do not move.
Lockhart froze. Blood trickled from his split lip. He looked at Julia and his smile returned. He said she would not shoot him. She was not a killer. Julia's hand shook.
You murdered my father.
Lockhart took a step forward. He said, "Prove it." The watch meant nothing. The letters could be faked. He had friends in high places, and she had nothing but accusations. He took another step. Julia pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the small room. The bullet buried itself in the floor 6 inches from Lockhart's boot. He stopped.
The next one goes in your chest.
Lockhart raised his hands. Rhett grabbed the knife from the floor and pressed it against Lockhart's throat.
Sit down.
Lockhart sat. Rhett tied his hands with a length of rope from the supply shelf, while Julia kept the gun trained on him. Then they dragged him outside and across the yard to the fort commander's quarters. It took 20 minutes of pounding on the door before the commander emerged in his nightshirt, looking furious. Rhett handed him the letters and the pocket watch.
Roland Lockhart has been aiding the bandit raids, and he murdered Julia Walsh's father. We have proof.
The commander read the letters by lamplight, while 2 soldiers held Lockhart at gunpoint. His face darkened with every line. When he finished, he looked at Lockhart with disgust. The commander said Lockhart would be held in the stockade until the circuit judge arrived. He thanked Rhett and Julia for their courage and told them to get some rest. The trial would begin in 5 days. Julia and Rhett walked back across the frozen yard in silence. The adrenaline was fading, and exhaustion crashed over them like a wave. When they reached the edge of the fort, Julia stopped and turned to face him.
You saved my life in there.
You saved mine first.
She smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her. It made her even more beautiful.
I do not know how to thank you.
You do not have to.
They stood there in the cold wind, and the space between them felt heavy with everything unsaid. Rhett wanted to tell her that he had not felt this alive in years, that she had walked into his office and shattered every safe, boring plan he had made for his life, that he would follow her into 100 more dangerous nights if she asked. But the words stuck in his throat. Julia reached out and took his hand.
Stay with me tonight. I do not want to be alone.
Rhett nodded. They walked to the small cabin she rented on the edge of town. Inside it was barely warmer than outside. Julia lit the stove, and they sat close to the heat. She told him about her father, about how he had taught her to ride and shoot and bargain with traders from 3 territories, about how he had promised her the land would always be hers, about how she had found him cold and still on the cabin floor with Lockhart's watch clutched in his fist. Rhett listened and did not interrupt. When she finished talking, she leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes.
I was so afraid I would lose everything.
You did not lose. You won.
We won.
Rhett put his arm around her and felt her relax into him. They sat like that until the fire burned low and the first pale light of dawn crept through the window. The next 5 days passed in a blur. Word spread through Cottonwood about Lockhart's arrest, and the town divided sharply. Half the people praised Julia and Rhett as heroes. The other half refused to believe that the soft-spoken dispatcher could be guilty. Lockhart had spent years building trust, and he had powerful friends. The stage company sent a lawyer from Bismarck to defend him. The circuit judge arrived on schedule and set up court in the fort's mess hall. The trial began on a gray morning, with snow falling. Julia and Rhett sat in the front row and watched Lockhart walk in wearing clean clothes and a calm expression. He looked like a man who had nothing to fear. The prosecutor presented the letters in the pocket watch. He called Julia to testify. She stood and told the court everything, about her father's suspicions, about the forged land papers, about finding the watch, about Lockhart's confession in his office. The defense lawyer tore into her testimony. He said she was a grieving daughter, inventing a story to cope with her father's natural death. He said the letters could have been planted. He said the watch could have been stolen. He painted Lockhart as a dedicated public servant, being targeted by a vengeful woman and a reckless bank clerk. Rhett watched the jury's faces and saw doubt. They were losing. Then the prosecutor called his final witness, a man named Samuel Trent, who worked as a guard on the stage line. Trent testified that he had seen Lockhart meeting with known bandits in a saloon 2 months ago. He had kept quiet because he was afraid, but he could not stay silent anymore. The defense lawyer tried to discredit him, but Trent held firm. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Lockhart's face went gray. The judge sentenced him to hang. Julia closed her eyes, and Rhett saw tears slip down her cheeks. It was over. The judge ordered the bank to return Julia's land immediately. He also ordered an investigation into the stage company's security practices. Rhett resigned from the bank that afternoon. He told his supervisor he could not work for an institution that had allowed fraud to pass through unchecked. His supervisor did not argue. Outside the fort, Julia was waiting for him. She had been quiet since the verdict, and Rhett did not know what she was thinking.
Are you all right?
I do not know. I thought I would feel better when it was over.
It takes time.
I keep thinking about what he said. That I have nothing. That even with the land back, I am still alone.
Rhett stopped walking and turned to face her.
You are not alone.
You are going back to Bismarck. You have a life there.
I quit my job. I am not going anywhere.
Julia stared at him.
Why would you do that?
Because I do not want to go back to writing lies in a ledger. I want to stay here and help you rebuild. If you will let me.
She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her expression. Hope, maybe. Or something deeper.
You barely know me.
I know you are brave. I know you fight for what is right. I know you walked into my office 3 weeks ago and turned my whole world upside down.
Julia laughed, and it was shaky, but real.
That is a terrible reason to throw away your career.
It is the best reason I have ever had.
She reached up and cupped his face in her cold hands.
You are reckless.
I am learning.
She kissed him, and it was soft, and tentative, and perfect. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright.
Stay then. Help me rebuild. But I am not easy to live with.
Good. I am tired of easy.
They spent the next week working on Julia's cabin. The roof needed patching, and the stove needed a new chimney pipe. Rhett had never done manual labor like this before, and his hands blistered within 2 days. Julia teased him, but she also showed him how to set the wood properly, and how to seal the gaps with clay. They worked side by side, and fell into an easy rhythm. At night, they sat by the fire and talked. Rhett told her about growing up in a city where everything was orderly and boring. Julia told him about riding with her father to trade with the Choctaw families who still lived in the northern hills. She told him about the shame of losing her mother's heritage when the land was stolen, about feeling like she did not belong anywhere.
My mother was Choctaw. My father was Irish. I grew up stuck between 2 worlds and never fully part of either.
You belong here. You fought for this place.
I fought to keep it. That does not mean I know what to do with it now.
We will figure it out.
She smiled at him, and he felt the weight of the word "we settle" between them like a promise. The stage line rerouted back through Cottonwood after the bandits were arrested. The town started to recover. People who had been ready to pack up and leave began to rebuild. Rhett took a job as a land surveyor, helping families file proper claims. It was honest work, and it paid enough. Julia reopened her father's trading post and started bringing goods in from the northern tribes. Business was slow at first, but word spread. By the end of the month, she had more customers than she could handle. Rhett helped her keep the books, and she taught him how to negotiate. One night, she told him she had never expected to be happy again after her father died.
I thought I would spend the rest of my life angry.
Are you still angry?
A little. But mostly, I am grateful.
For what?
For you. For this. For having something worth protecting.
Rhett pulled her close and kissed the top of her head.
I am not going anywhere.
Good. Because I am not letting you go.
Spring came slowly to Dakota Territory. The ice broke on the river, and the supply wagons started running on schedule again. Rhett and Julia fell into a life that felt both new and ancient. They worked hard and slept heavy, and woke up tangled together in the narrow cabin bed. People in town started calling them a couple, and neither of them corrected it. One morning, Julia woke up and realized she was not lonely anymore. It was a strange feeling. She had carried loneliness for so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Rhett was splitting wood outside when she found him. She watched him work for a minute and felt something warm and fierce settle in her chest.
I love you.
He stopped mid-swing and turned to look at her. His face was flushed from the work, and his eyes were bright.
Say that again.
I love you. I have been trying not to say it because I thought it was too soon, but I do not care anymore. I love you.
Rhett dropped the axe and crossed the yard in 3 long strides. He picked her up and spun her around and kissed her hard. When he set her down, he was grinning like a fool.
I love you too. I have loved you since the day you walked into my office and threatened to shoot me.
I never threatened to shoot you.
You had a gun.
I always have a gun.
Exactly.
She laughed and kissed him again. They stood there in the pale, spring sunlight, and Rhett thought about how his life had changed in the span of 4 months. He had left a job he hated, and lost a life he barely recognized, and found something real in its place. Julia pulled back and looked up at him with those warm brown eyes.
When the judge comes through next month, I want to file the claim properly. I want the land in my name, with no questions.
We will do it together. I will stand with you and sign whatever you need.
You do not have to do that.
I know. I want to.
She smiled and touched his face gently.
Then, we will do it. Together.
The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and waiting. Rhett helped Julia repair the fences and mark the property lines clearly. They drove stakes at every corner and painted them white, so there would be no confusion. Julia kept the forged deed locked in a wooden box under the floorboards, and the real deed close to her heart in a leather pouch. She had written to the tribal council in Oklahoma and received a letter back confirming her father's original claim and her inheritance rights. It was not much, but it was enough to prove Roland had lied. When the circuit judge finally arrived in Cottonwood, the whole town turned out. Judge Marcus Fielding was a tall, severe man with gray hair and a reputation for fairness. He set up court in the back room of the general store and heard cases from dawn to dusk. Julia and Rhett waited their turn nervously. Roland was there too, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed and a tight smile on his face. He had not been seen much since the night at the riverbank. People said he was planning to leave town before the railroad contract fell through. When Julia's name was called, she stood up and walked to the front with Rhett beside her. Judge Fielding looked down at them over his reading glasses. The judge's voice was deep and measured. He asked Julia to present her case. She laid out the documents carefully. The original deed from her father, the letter from the tribal council, the forged deed with Roland's signature. Rhett stood beside her and added his testimony about the bank's involvement and Roland's attempts to force the sale. The room was silent as the judge examined each paper. Roland sat very still, and his smile never wavered. Finally, Judge Fielding set the papers down and looked at Roland. The judge called Roland forward. Roland stood slowly and walked to the front, with his hands clasped behind his back. He looked calm and confident. The judge asked if he had anything to say. Roland spoke smoothly. He claimed he had purchased the deed in good faith from a land agent and had no knowledge of forgery. He said Julia's father had sold the land before his death, and Julia was mistaken about her inheritance. It was a good performance, convincing and polite. But the judge was not swayed. He held up the forged deed and pointed to the signature. The judge said the handwriting did not match the official records, and the seal was incorrect. He declared the forged deed invalid and restored Julia's claim. The room erupted in whispers. Roland's face went pale, and his smile finally cracked. He tried to argue, but the judge cut him off. The judge said Roland would face charges for fraud and conspiracy. He ordered the sheriff to take Roland into custody until a formal trial could be arranged. The sheriff stood up and walked toward Roland with handcuffs ready. Roland looked around the room wildly. His eyes landed on Julia, and for a moment she saw real hatred there. Then he turned and bolted for the door. The sheriff shouted and lunged after him. Roland shoved past two men and stumbled out into the street. Rhett was already moving. He pushed through the crowd and ran outside. Julia followed close behind. Roland ran toward the stables. He was fast, but Rhett was faster. Rhett caught up to him just as Roland reached the stable door. He grabbed Roland's shoulder and spun him around. Roland swung wildly, and his fist connected with Rhett's jaw. Rhett staggered back, but did not let go. They grappled in the dirt, and Roland fought like a cornered animal. Julia reached them and kicked Roland hard in the side. He gasped and went down. The sheriff arrived a moment later and dragged Roland to his feet. He snapped the handcuffs on and hauled him toward the makeshift jail. Roland was shouting now, his polite mask completely gone. He cursed Julia and Rhett and threatened to ruin them both. But his threats were empty. Everyone could see it. Julia stood in the street, breathing hard and watching him go. Rhett touched her shoulder gently.
It is over.
Not yet. There is one more thing.
She turned and walked back toward the general store. Rhett followed. Inside, the judge was still seated at the makeshift bench. Julia approached and placed the leather pouch on the table.
I want to file a formal claim. I want the land registered in my name with no ambiguity. And I want to add a name to the deed.
The judge raised an eyebrow. The judge asked whose name. Julia glanced back at Rhett, and he stepped forward.
Rhett Hawkins. My partner.
The judge looked between them and nodded slowly. He opened his ledger and began to write. When he finished, he stamped the page and handed Julia a freshly signed document. The judge said the land was now officially hers and Rhett's jointly. He said no one could take it from them without due process and a court order. Julia took the deed and felt something heavy lift from her chest. She had spent so long fighting to hold on to this piece of ground. Now it was truly hers. Rhett put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. They walked out of the store together and stood in the spring sunlight. People were still gathered in the street talking about Roland's arrest. A few of them nodded to Julia and Rhett as they passed. Respect was slow to come in Cottonwood, but it came eventually. That night, they celebrated quietly at the cabin. Julia cooked venison stew, and Rhett opened a bottle of whiskey he had been saving. They sat by the fire and talked about what came next. Julia wanted to expand the garden and maybe build a proper barn. Rhett wanted to bring in a few head of cattle and start a small herd. They made plans late into the night, and when they finally went to bed, they were both exhausted and happy. Spring turned to summer. The fort started to empty out as the army reassigned troops to other posts. The stage line rerouted through Cottonwood after all. The dispatcher who replaced Roland was honest, and the town began to grow again. New families arrived, and new businesses opened. Julia and Rhett worked their land and saved money, and slowly built something solid. One evening in late June, they rowed out to the river. The water was high from snowmelt, and the cottonwoods were thick with green leaves. They dismounted and walked down to the bank where they had stood months before, in the cold and the dark. Julia looked out at the water and thought about how much had changed.
Do you ever regret it? Leaving the bank and staying here?
Not for a second.
Even when it is hard?
Especially then.
She smiled and took his hand. They stood together in the evening light and watched the river flow past. Rhett thought about the pocket watch still tucked in his saddlebag. He had kept it as a reminder. Not of Roland, or the murder, or the lies, but of the moment everything shifted. The moment he chose to stand with Julia instead of walking away. He pulled her close and kissed the top of her head.
I love you.
I love you too.
They stayed by the river until the sun set and the stars came out. Then they rowed back to the cabin together, side by side, the night warm and the future wide open ahead of them. The summer passed in a rhythm of work and rest. Rhett built the barn with help from a few men in town. Julia planted rows of vegetables and herbs and tended them carefully. They raised 3 heifers and a bull and started a small herd, just as Rhett had hoped. The cattle grazed on the open prairie, and Julia learned to ride fence lines and check for strays. She was a natural. Rhett watched her work and felt a fierce pride. She had fought so hard for this land, and now she was making it thrive. In August, they rode into town for supplies and heard news that Roland had been tried and sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. The murder charge had been dropped for lack of evidence, but the fraud conviction stuck. People in Cottonwood stopped talking about him after that. He became just another cautionary tale. A man who had tried to cheat the system and lost. Julia felt nothing when she heard the news. No anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of closure. One evening in late summer, Julia and Rhett sat on the porch and watched the sun go down. The air was warm and the crickets were loud. Julia rested her head on Rhett's shoulder.
I want to marry you.
Rhett turned to look at her, surprised.
Are you asking me or telling me?
Both.
He laughed and pulled her close.
Then yes. Absolutely yes.
They married in September. It was a simple ceremony at the cabin, with the sheriff as witness, and a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. Julia wore a dress she had sewn herself from pale blue fabric. Rhett wore his best shirt and his cleanest trousers and his cowboy hat. They stood together under the cottonwood tree by the river and spoke their vows. When the preacher pronounced them, married, Rhett kissed Julia like it was the first time and the last time, all at once. A few people from town came to celebrate. There was food and music and dancing. Someone brought a fiddle and played old songs. Julia danced with Rhett until her feet hurt, and then they danced some more. When the guests finally left and the sun had set, they walked back to the cabin hand in hand. The night was cool, and the stars were bright. Rhett stopped at the door and turned to Julia.
Are you happy?
Yes. Are you?
More than I ever thought I could be.
She smiled and kissed him. They went inside and closed the door behind them. The fire was burning low in the hearth, and the cabin was warm and quiet. Julia thought about her father and her mother and all the people who had come before her. She thought about the land and the fight to keep it. And she thought about Rhett and the life they were building together. It was not perfect. It was hard and uncertain and sometimes lonely. But it was theirs. And that was enough. Autumn came, and the leaves turned gold. The cattle fattened up on the prairie grass, and Julia and Rhett prepared for winter. They cut wood and stacked it high against the cabin wall. They canned vegetables and smoked meat and filled the cellar with supplies. When the first snow fell in November, they were ready. The winter was hard, but not as hard as the one before. They had each other, and that made all the difference. On the coldest nights, they huddled by the fire and told stories. Rhett talked about his childhood in Missouri and his parents who had died young. Julia talked about her father and the Choctaw traditions her mother had taught her. They learned each other's histories and carried them together. In December, Rhett rode into town and came back with a small wooden box. He gave it to Julia by the fire that night. Inside was a silver ring with a single turquoise stone.
I know we are already married, but I wanted you to have this.
Julia slipped the ring on her finger and kissed him.
It is perfect. Thank you.
That winter passed slowly, but peacefully. When spring came again, they planted a bigger garden and bought 2 more heifers. The town continued to grow. The fort closed officially in April, and the army moved out for good. Some people left, but most stayed. Cottonwood was finding its footing as a real town now, not just a supply stop or a military outpost, a place where people lived and worked and built futures. Julia and Rhett were part of that. They were known now, respected. The land was theirs and no one questioned it. One warm evening in May, they rowed out to the river again. It had become a tradition, a place they returned to when they needed to remember where they had started. They dismounted and walked down to the water. The cottonwoods were green and full, and the river was high and fast. Julia stood at the edge and looked out.
I used to come here when I was a girl. My father would bring me, and we would fish. He told me this land was mine, and I had to protect it. I did not understand then. I thought he meant just the ground and the grass. But he meant more than that. He meant the life we could build here, the people we could become.
Rhett put his arm around her.
He would be proud of you.
I think he would be proud of us.
She leaned into him, and they stood there together as the sun set. The sky turned orange and pink, and the river caught the light. It was beautiful and wild and theirs. Rhett thought about the man he had been a year ago, tired and lost and going through the motions. He barely recognized that person now. Julia had changed him, not by fixing him or saving him, but by showing him what it looked like to fight for something real. To stand your ground and refuse to be moved. He kissed her temple, and she turned to look up at him. Her eyes were bright, and her smile was soft.
I love you, Julia Hawkins.
I love you too, Rhett Hawkins.
They stood together at the riverbank, with the town behind them in the distance. The future was uncertain. There would be more hard winters and dry summers and struggles they could not predict. But they would face them together. And that was all that mattered. Summer arrived hot and dry. The cattle needed constant watering, and Julia spent long days riding the fence lines. Rhett worked alongside her, and they moved as a team, They did not talk much during the work hours. There was no need. They understood each other without words. In the evenings, they cooled off in the river and talked about their plans. Julia wanted to start breeding horses. Rhett thought they should invest in more land if any came available. They dreamed together and made lists and saved every dollar they could. One afternoon in July, a rider came to the cabin. He was young and nervous and carried a letter. Julia took it and recognized the seal of the tribal council. She opened it carefully and read. Her face went still. Rhett stepped closer.
What is it?
They want me to come to Oklahoma. There is a gathering of families who were displaced. They are working on reclaiming lands and restoring records. They want me to testify about what happened here.
When?
Next month.
Then, we will go.
It is a long trip.
I do not care. You are not going alone.
She looked up at him and felt a rush of gratitude.
Thank you.
They left in early August. The journey took 2 weeks by horse and stage. Oklahoma was hotter and drier than Dakota Territory. The land was red and flat and stretched endlessly. The gathering was held in a large tent outside of a small settlement. Dozens of families had come from all over. Julia listened to their stories and felt a deep ache in her chest. So many people had lost so much: land, family, history. She testified about her father's claim and Roland's fraud. The council listened carefully and took notes. When she finished, an elder thanked her and said her testimony would help others fight similar battles. Julia felt a quiet pride. On the way back to Dakota Territory, Rhett asked her how she felt.
Sad, but also grateful. My father fought hard to keep our land, and I almost lost it. But I did not. And now, maybe someone else will not lose theirs either.
You did the right thing.
We did the right thing. I could not have done any of this without you.
Yes, you could have. But I am glad you did not have to.
She smiled and took his hand. They rode in comfortable silence the rest of the way. They arrived home in late August. The cabin looked small and sturdy and welcoming. The cattle were fine, and the garden had been tended by a neighbor. Julia and Rhett unpacked and settled back into their routine. But something had shifted. The trip had reminded them how big the world was, and how small their piece of it. And yet their piece felt more precious because of it. They had built this together, against odds that should have broken them. One night in September, they sat on the porch and watched the stars. The air was cooling, and autumn was coming. Julia leaned against Rhett and closed her eyes.
I am happy.
Me too.
I mean really happy. Not just content. Not just okay. Happy.
I know what you mean.
Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not come to buy the land that day?
All the time.
And?
And I think I would have spent the rest of my life pushing papers and lying to people and hating myself.
I think I would have lost the land. And then, I would have drifted. Angry and alone.
We saved each other.
Yes. We did.
They sat in silence for a while. Then, Rhett stood and pulled Julia to her feet.
Dance. With me.
There is no music.
I do not care.
He put his arms around her, and they swayed together in the dark. The stars were bright overhead, and the night was cool and still. Julia rested her head on Rhett's chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong. She thought about all the moments that had led them here, the anger and the fear and the cold winter nights, the fight at the riverbank and the trial and the long journey to Oklahoma. All of it had been worth it, because it had led to this, to standing on their own land with the person they loved, to building a life that was honest and hard and beautiful. Rhett kissed the top of her head and held her close.
I am never letting you go.
Good. Because I am never letting you go either.
They stayed there on the porch until the night grew late and the chill set in. Then they went inside and closed the door and lay down together in the warmth of their home. Outside, the wind picked up and the cottonwoods rustled. The river flowed on in the dark, and Cottonwood slept quietly under the wide Dakota sky.